Welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show. Coming up this week, a tribute to Primož Roglič, the man who can never be kept down, the man who always gets up whenever he's knocked down, the man who I would say is the most successful rider in the history of La Vuelta. I'll also look back at the Tour of Britain, which was another race to forget for Ineos Grenadiers, plus the BEMER Cyclassics, Tour de Romandie, and Grand Premier Industria Artigianato. This week in the world of racing, we learnt that it's the end of an era. Robert Geesink and Thomas de Gendt rode the final Grand Tour stages of their respective careers yesterday, and for Geesink, it was the final race in a career that started all the way back in 2007. Chapeau to both of them, and thank you both for entertaining us over the years. We also learnt that Stefan Kung finally has a Grand Tour stage win in his back pocket. He smashed the individual time trial yesterday at La Vuelta, dominating from start to finish. And I'm so glad he's got that monkey off his back. He really deserved that win. Side note, double discs are not a good idea if there's even an iota of wind. I spent my whole time watching Edoardo Affini with my heart in my mouth, thinking he was about to get blown away in a gust of wind. There's a lot of talk about rider safety at the moment, as there should be, but then they go and put a disc wheel on the front of a rider's bike. And finally, we learnt that nobody has won La Vuelta more times than Primož Roglič. In winning the race yesterday, he equalled Roberto Heras, the only other rider to have won the race 4 times. However, Roglič has now won 15 stages of the race over 6 participations, and the only time he hasn't won or finished on the podium of it was in 2022, when he crashed and abandoned. It was the usual sort of clinical performance by Roglič, but despite his consistency at the race, there's always that doubt in your mind that something won't go to plan. Something will happen that will prevent him winning, because it so often has at other races. But I think that that's what makes him so lovable. Because whilst he's quite calculating and clinical as a rider, he also has that air of fallibility about him. Things can go wrong in spectacular fashion, but when they don't, it's very, very hard to beat him. But when you look back at the last 3 weeks, it really couldn't have gone any better for Roglič and Red Bull Bull-Bora-Hansgrohe. It looked like a mistake to give O'Connor that much time, and in reality, that could have come back to bite them. But as it turned out, it meant that Red Bull only had to spend 1 day of the race defending the race lead. Of course, they still had to do a lot of work for Roglič over the course of the race, but Decathlon AG2R took a lot of the responsibility. Roglič himself had some days where he looked on par with the others, but importantly, a couple of days where he was head and shoulders above his rivals. Roglič has now had 88 career wins, 48 of which have come in the last 4 seasons, an average of 12 per year. That man is a machine. I can't think of any other rider who has the physical and mental resilience to come back from crashes and disappointments that he's been through over the last few years. Nothing seems to sway his determination and motivation, and by all accounts, it sounds like he's already had a big impact on those around him at Red Bull Bora-Hansgrohe, riders and staff alike. Whatever he does for the rest of his career, he will go down as one of the best riders in the sport's history. For everyone else in the race, allowing O'Connor that much time was a bad idea because he finished in front of everybody else. Whilst he lost some time on his lead on most of the big mountain stages, he never completely cracked, did he? And that meant that Mas had to sit off a 3rd overall, and Carapaz didn't finish on the podium. I think most people will agree, though, that O'Connor really deserved that result. He took the initiative to go with that move, and he defended admirably with his team. I guess there might be a tinge of disappointment not to have won in the end, but there was an inevitability that Roglič would land the hammer blow one day, and that came on the steep slopes of Friday's summit finish. It is O'Connor's first podium at a Grand Tour though, having finished just off it at both the Giro and the Tour previously. What though a departing present that is for his team Decathlon AG2R. Now unfortunately, none of you correctly predicted the GC Top 10 in the correct order in the comments section last week, so I get to keep my hoodie on my back. But well done to Andras Zabo, who got pretty close. These hoodies are still available to purchase though over at shop.globalcyclingnetwork.com. Thanks too to Guillem Azevedo, who pointed out that I correctly predicted back in January that Visma Lease a Bike would not win a Grand Tour this season.
Visma Lease a Bike won't win a Grand Tour in 2024.
Unfortunately, I think that was the only one of my hot takes that were correct, but I'll take it. That said, my prediction from a week ago wasn't too bad. Let me know your predictions down below. I'm going to play it safe and say Roglič for the win, Mas second and Ben O'Connor hanging on for third, Vine for the mountains and Skjelmose for the best young rider. I'll take that. Got Mas and O'Connor in the wrong order, but nailed the rest. So yes, Vine did take the mountains jersey, despite what appeared to be the best efforts of teammate Marc Soler to deny him on the final road stage. Vine had described the jersey as unfinished business from a couple of years ago, so it was good to see him take that. And what about Skjelmose? He had a fantastic final week, moving from 11th to 5th overall over the final 7 stages and taking the best young riders classification too. That is by far the best Grand Tour of his career so far, and it really bodes very well for the future. The green jersey went to Caden Groves, but that was because Wout van Aert crashed out of the race on stage 16. Just when it looked to be back at his very best, another piece of misfortune. His team said he was put in intensive care that evening due to injuries to his knee, and later confirmed that that was the end of his season, which is gutting for him and all cycling fans really, because it felt like he still had a lot left to give and to win this year. We wish him all the best in his recovery. There was also a disappointing end to the race for a number of Red Bull-Bora-Hansgrohe riders who fell victim to food poisoning on the penultimate day. Danny Martinez and Patrick Gamper both pulled out of stage 20, whilst Nico Denz valiantly ploughed on. He spent 160 k's alone that day, only to miss the time cut by just under a minute. I think all of us were hoping that the UCI commissaires might make a special exception for him to allow him to finish the final stage in the overall race, but I guess rules are rules, and he was very humble in accepting that. It is a cruel sport though, isn't it? A few other things of note over the final week of the race. Eddie Dunbar of Jayco Alula took a brilliant second stage victory on Saturday, not from a breakaway, but from the group of favourites. Now, admittedly, being out of the GC meant he had a bit more freedom than some of the others, but at the same time, he rode that final climb quicker than anybody else on the day, and that was set to decide the final podium spots at the race, so they weren't hanging about. Groves won a third stage win on Wednesday. Impressive, really, in a race that had very few sprint opportunities on paper, whilst it was a race that a Keeper Kern farmer will never forget. They dominated stage 18, with Urko Barada getting the better of some very big names in the breakaway to take the team's third stage win of the race. One of the most memorable moments of that stage, though, was Matteo Cattaneo being called out of the break with 13 k's to go by his Soudal Quick-Step team car. Why? To help limit the losses of Mikel Landa. An absolutely bizarre decision, given Cattaneo's chances of taking a stage win for them at that point, and the proximity to the finish, which meant he'd make little to no difference to Landa's slide down GC. I can only imagine that they had tried to make that call earlier, but that the team radio wasn't working. Whatever the reason, you've got to say it looked utterly ridiculous, didn't it? The other stage win last week went to Marc Soler, who will forever remain an enigma in cycling. It's come to the point where you expect the unexpected with that man, but even though that's the case, he still surprised you. He's entertaining to watch though, that's for sure. Anyway, that wraps up the Grand Tours for another season, and so I'd like you to help me rank the men's ones in terms of how entertaining you found them overall. So for me, I would say Tour first, Vuelta second, Giro third this year, because even though the Tour was effectively a done deal in terms of GC in the final week, I still thought it delivered the goods. Anyway, let me know in the comments below what you thought of each one and which was the biggest disappointment. Right, on to some other races now, and I'll start with the BEMER Cyclassics in Hamburg, Germany, a race which tends to finish in a bunch sprint despite a few lumps and bumps to be dealt with along the way. This year was no different, although there was a point where it looked as though Red Bull-Bora-Hansgrohe might prevent a bunch sprint. So they rode so fast through one of the final right-hand bends that they opened up a significant gap to the rest of the main peloton. That gap was closed, but it might have been the difference between winning and losing on the day. Olaf Koy of Visma Lease a Bike, who was the only rider to have latched onto their back wheels, had an armchair ride to the finish line, whilst Lidl Trek had to close that gap, and then Milan got boxed in before he was able to make his sprint. When he did go, it was very clear he had the most power on the day, But sprinting isn't just about raw power, and so it was a deserved win for Coy in what was his first win in a World Tour level one-day race. Meanwhile, at the Tour of Britain, there was some really fantastic racing over the first few days. I thoroughly enjoyed watching it. Paul Magnier of Soudal Quickstep was the dominant force in the sprints, winning 3 of the 7 stages. But unfortunately, he was denied the points jersey and another shot at a stage win yesterday because he was involved in a crash with 35 k's to go. The young Frenchman stayed in hospital overnight for observation after scans revealed that he'd suffered concussion. Tom Pidcock of Ineos Grenadiers was involved in that same crash and also had to abandon. It was on stage 2 of the race into Redcar where the GC took shape, and it was a day to forget for Ineos Grenadiers. So having helped control the race and then been actually quite aggressive, they ended up in a situation where the only rider they had in the front group was Ben Swift, whilst Tom Pidcock was struggling to follow the moves behind. Somewhat inexplicably, Swift then dropped back to try and help Pidcock regain contact. I've got no idea if that was Swift's own decision or if it was a call from the team car, but either way it was the wrong one because they got close but never quite closed the gap and basically lost all hope of a top 10 on GC, let alone a podium or a win in their home race. But whilst it all unravelled for Ineos Grenadiers, it all went right for Israel Premier Tech. They ended up in the front split with 3 riders that day, Blackmore, Stewart and Williams, and it was the Welshman who would make the final selection. Quite handily for him, Alaphilippe, who joined him, had lost time the day before, and so it was only Oscar Onley that he had to keep a close eye on in the finale. He didn't have too much to worry about though as it ended up, because he outsprinted both of them and then outsprinted a much bigger group the following day into Barnsley to increase his advantage in the leader's jersey. And with the rest of the stages all finishing in sprints, Williams became the first British winner of the Tour of Britain since Steve Cummings in 2016. Well deserved too, I would say, not just for Williams, but for the whole team there who rode brilliantly from start to finish. The final day, incidentally, was won by Bahrain's victorious Matev Govakar. On to the Tour de Romandie Féminin now, where it was a 1-2 for SD Works, and another race where Kopecky and Vollering were allowed by their team to fight things out between them. So the opening day would prove crucial for the general classification, not through who won, Elisa Balsamo of Lidl Trek, but because of who finished second. Lotte Kopecky picked up 6 bonus seconds there, which were the difference between her winning and losing the general classification of the race. On the summit finish to Vessoran the following day, SD Works took control with a high pace being set by Niamh Fisher-Black, which set up an attack by her teammates. So Lotte Kopecky and Demi Vollering found themselves in a 3-rider group with Guy Rielini for company. The Italian had the confidence to attack them both in the last couple of kilometres of that summit finish, but unfortunately it was a move that would come back to bite her as both SD Works riders sailed past. So the two of them were then locked together all the way to the line, with Vollering doing most of the work on the way to it. And then we had a sprint to the line. Just like Strade Bianche a couple of years back, the two of them sprinted it out, with Vollering taking a victory by the narrowest of margins. However, with only 4 bonus seconds difference between first and second on a stage, Kopecky took a 2-second lead into the third and final stage. That final day was animated by 2 riders who will join forces next year at Lidl Trek. Fisher-Black was virtual leader on the road for much of the day and accompanied by Rihanna Marcus of Visma Lease Bike. And whilst their advantage wasn't enough for the New Zealander to threaten her 2 teammates at the top of the GC, they did stay away and fight it out for stage victory between them. In that sprint, Marcus looked like she may have celebrated just a little early, but after a brief scare, she safely took the stage win. There was actually a big crash behind them and away from the cameras, but Kopecky came through to take third, and with that she took the overall title at the race. That was her 12th win of the season and 3rd GC victory of the year. In fact, I'm going to be very interested to see which direction she goes in next year, because you can really see her focusing on the general classification at the Tour de France Femmes avec Zwift, given how well she's been climbing this season, and then perhaps foregoing some of her speed in the sprints. We shall see. If you missed any of the action from that race, you can catch back up on demand on Discovery Plus and Max, where you'll be able to watch a full season of bike racing. At the Grand Premier Industria Artigianato, Mark Hirschi took the 6th win of his season. He's back on form this year, isn't he? He got the better of 22-year-old Uruguayan rider Guillermo Silva, who's been having a very good year for Caja Rural. Just one more race to report on, and that is La Choralis Fourmies. Apologies for the mispronunciation. Reason being that I wanted to highlight the performance of Kat Ferguson. Those of you who follow me on X might have seen me waxing lyrical about Ferguson this year, mainly because I love looking at her first cycling results page and not seeing a single result outside the top 3 all year, be that road racing or cyclocross. She's still a junior rider, but she rode with Movistar at Fourmies yesterday and kept that record intact. She finished second to Silvia Zanardi of Human Powered Health in what was a bunch sprint finish. A very impressive start to your pro career when you're still only 18 years old. Transfer news now, and the biggest name mover last week was Sergio Higuita. After 3 years at Bull-Bora-Hansgrohe and now Red Bull, he'll spend the next 2 at Astana. And hopefully he'll get back on track. It's been a year and a half now since his last win as a pro. There were 2 transfers that were announced just too late to make it onto last week's racing news show. So both Axel Laurence and Søren Kragh Andersen are leaving Alpecin de Koenig. Under 23 world champion Laurence is going to Ineos Grenadiers, while Søren Kragh Andersen hooks up with Lidl Trek. Both more than capable, of course, in the spring cobbled classics. It leaves a bit of a hole for Mathieu van der Poel in terms of his help in those races next year. Israel Premier Tech have signed another rider. This time it's Mathis Louvel of Arkea, whilst Ali Wollaston will move from AG Insurance to FDJ Suez at the start of next year. And just finally, talented British junior Imogen Wolf has been snapped up by Visma Lease Bike, where she'll spend the next couple of seasons. Oh, one more actually. Dan Bigham was confirmed last week as becoming head of engineering at Red Bull Bora-Hansgrohe, having finished his contract with the Ineos Grenadiers just after the Olympic Games. And it's going to be very interesting to see what kind of developments he can make at the Red Bull team. Right then, that is all for this week's show. I'll be back next Monday to wrap up the Grand Prix of Quebec and Montreal, where Pogacar will return to competition, plus the European Championships and a handful of Italian one-day races. I'll see you then.